Hi, boys and girls. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to pull up your book, Mr. Popper's Penguins, if you want to read along with me, or you can follow on the screen. So today we'll be reading a few chapters to hopefully speed along in our book. So last time we read together, or we read chapter 11, we ended up learning that Mr. Popper got a friend for Captain Cook, and her name is Greta. And she was sent to him by a zoo who could no longer take care of her because she was having the same sad feelings as Captain Cook was. Um, the Poppers ended up turning their entire living room into an Arctic zone so that the penguins can feel more at home and be less sad. So let's move on to chapter 12. Uh, and the title is More Mouths to Feed. Let me just put this perfectly into the box here. And I think that looks pretty good. Maybe. There we go. So chapter 12, More Mouths to Feed. So the next day, Mr. Popper called an engineer and had a large freezing plant installed in the cellar, and took Captain Cook and Greta down there to live. A cellar would be what we call a basement. Okay? So the basement wouldn't necessarily be all fancy like you have it today, but just maybe concrete floors and brick walls. Okay. So Greta and Captain Cook are down there to live. I'm here now. Then he had the furnace taken out and moved upstairs into the living room. It looked very odd there, but as Miss Popper said, it was a relief at least to not have to wear their overcoats all the time. Mr. Popper was quite worried when he found that all these changes were going to be very expensive. The refrigerator engineer was worried too when he found that Mr. Popper had practically no money. However, Mr. Popper promised to pay as soon as he could, and the man let him have everything on credit. So having something on credit means, so the repairman would write down Mr. Popper's name in his little book saying, okay, Mr. Popper owes me this much money. So um, back then they used to do that to people, give you things on credit, okay? And you would promise to come back in X amount of time to pay your bill. It was a good thing that Mr. Popper got the penguins moved when he did, because Mrs. Popper had been right about the eggs. The rookery had scarcely been moved to the basement when Greta laid the first egg. 3 days later the second one appeared. Since Mr. Popper knew that penguins lay only 2 eggs a season, he was astonished when a little later the third egg was found under Greta. Whether the change in climate had changed the penguins' breeding habit, Mr. Popper never knew, but every third day a new one would appear until there were 10 eggs in all. Now penguin eggs are so large that the mother can sit on only 2 at a time, and this created quite a problem. Mr. Popper solved it, however, by distributing the extra eggs under hot water bottles and electric heating pads kept just at penguin body heat. The penguin chicks, when they began to hatch, were not so handsomely marked as their mother and father. They were fuzzy, droll little creatures who grew at a tremendous rate. Captain Cook and Greta were kept very busy bringing food to them, though of course the Poppers all helped too. Mr. Popper, who had always been such a great reader, had no difficulty in thinking of names for the penguin children. They were Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. Still, he was rather relieved that there were no more than 10 to name. Mrs. Popper too thought that this was about enough penguins for anybody, though they really did not make much difference to her in her housework, as as long as Mr. Popper and the children remembered to close the cellar door in the kitchen. The penguins all loved to climb the stairs that led up to the kitchen and never knew when to stop unless they found the kitchen door closed. Then, of course, they would turn around and toboggan down the steps again. This made rather a curious noise sometimes when Mrs. Popper was working in the kitchen, but she got used to it, as she had got used to many other strange things this winter. The freezing plant that Mr. Popper had got for the penguins downstairs was a large and good one. It made very large blocks of ice instead of small cubes, so that soon Mr. Popper had made a sort of ice castle down there for the 12 penguins to live in and climb over. Mr. Popper also dug a large hole in the cellar floor and made a swimming and diving pool for the birds. From time to time he would throw live fish in the pool for the penguins to dive for. They found this very refreshing because, to tell the truth, they had got a little tired of canned shrimp. The live fish were specially ordered and were brought all the way from the coast in tank cars and glass boxes to 432 Proudfoot Avenue. Unfortunately, they were quite expensive. It was nice that there were so many penguins because when two of them, usually Nelson and Columbus, got into a fight and began to spar at each other with their flippers, the 10 other penguins would all crowd around to watch the fight and make encouraging remarks. This made a very interesting little scene. Mr. Popper also flooded part of the cellar floor for an ice rink, and here the penguins often drilled, like a sort of small army, in fantastic marching movements and parades around the ice. The penguin Louisa seemed especially fond of leading these marching drills. It was quite a sight to see them after Mr. Popper had the idea of training Louisa to hold a small American flag in her beak while she proudly led the solemn parade. Janie and Bill would often bring their little friends home from school with them, and they would all go down and watch the penguins for hours. At night, instead of sitting and reading and smoking his pipe in the living room, as he had done before, Mr. Popper would put on his overcoat and take his things downstairs. There he would sit and read with his mittens on, looking up from time to time to see what his pets were doing. He often thought about the cold, distant regions in which the little creatures really belonged. Often, too, he thought about how different his life had been before the penguins had come to keep him occupied. It was January now, and already he dreaded to think of the time when spring would come, and he would have to leave them all day to go back to painting houses. Chapter 12. Money Worries. There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, saw Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must talk to you. Come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What's on your mind?" "Papa, I'm glad to see you have such a nice vacation, and I must say that it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for all those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put in the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is all our money gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat 12 penguins for a while." "Oh, no, Mamma," said Mr. Popper. "You don't really mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break the children's hearts, too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for quite a while. "I have an idea, Mamma," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we could have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper. "I have a better idea. We'll keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of trained seals acting in theaters? Of course I've heard of trained seals, answered Mrs. Popper. I even saw some once. They balanced balls on the ends of their noses. Very well, then, said Mr. Popper. If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins? Perhaps you're right, Papa. Of course I'm right, and you can help me train the penguins. The next day they had the piano moved down in the basement at one end of the ice rink. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she had married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice she soon began to remember some of the pieces she had forgotten. What these penguins like to do most, said Mr. Popper, is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columbus get in a fight with each other, and to climb up steps and toboggan down. And so we will build our act around these tricks. They don't need costumes anyway, said Mrs. Popper, looking at the droll little figures. They already have a costume. So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each different kind of act. Soon the penguins knew from hearing the music just what they were to do. When they were supposed to parade like a bunch of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. When the penguins were supposed to climb up and toboggan down, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable stepladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty piece called By the Brook. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn to play piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country.
Chapter 14, Mr. Greenbaum. Look here, said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we had better go down and see him. That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January. The Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march: Mr. Popper, Greta and Captain Cook, Columbus and Victoria, Mrs. Popper, Nelson and Jenny, Magellan and I cannot see that. Adelina, Bill and Janie, Scott and Isabella, and Ferdinand and Louisa. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on the bus, and the bus was on its way. Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go free? Asked Mr. Popper. Janie goes half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. Hush, said Mrs. Popper, as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. Say, mister, said the driver, where do you think you're going with that exhibit? Downtown, said Mr. Popper. Here, let's call it 50 cents and let it go at that. To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me, said the driver. It's a trained penguin act, explained Mr. Popper. Are they really birds? Asked the driver. Oh, yes, said Mr. Popper. I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner. Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner, said the driver. Fair enough, said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers in that case, but decided to let well enough alone. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, 2 in a seat, while the other passengers looked on. Sorry, said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone in the bus, but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this. It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any farther until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had got so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out into the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. "Hello," said the theater manager as the Poppers and the Penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard all about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper Penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The Penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6 each, looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. "All you people crowding around the door, go back where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." Then he got up to shut the door. The Poppers sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act, all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's Poppers performing penguins. First time on any stage, direct from the South Pole." He and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for the act. "Couldn't we call them Popper's pink-toed penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like it." "All right, show me the act," said Mr. Greenbaum. "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mama plays the piano." "Is that true, madam?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well, there's a piano behind you. You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madam?" "We'd better move the furniture first," said Bill. And that is the end of the chapter. So, today's assignment, if I go to Flipgrid, you cannot see what I wrote, but you have to write a court text. Okay, so I want you to write an expository paragraph, which is a court text, answering the question, if you had a pet penguin, which trick would you teach him and why? So you have to tell me 3 reasons why you would have chosen this particular trick to teach your penguin. Can't wait to see your answers and hear them. So I'm going to ask that you type it into the link that I've given you and then come video and tell us your answers. Looking forward to hearing it. Bye-bye.